The morning sun spilled across the cobblestone streets of New York's Upper East Side, where life carried on with an air of perfection. Brownstones lined the avenues like guardians of a world seemingly untouched by trouble. For Marisa Galloway, this neighborhood was her sanctuary, a fragile bubble she desperately fought to maintain for her daughters, Sophie and Emily. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior lay a storm brewing, one she couldn't quite define. Marisa, a special education teacher, approached her mornings with routine precision. She prepared Sophie's lunch, making sure to cut the crusts off her sandwiches just the way Sophie liked them, while Emily babbled happily in her high chair. Each action was deliberate, a ritual to ground herself amid the chaos of her ongoing custody battle. Her ex-husband, Zachariah Reed, had become increasingly distant, but it was his mother, Kathleen Lee, who loomed like a shadow over her life. Kathleen had a way of making her presence known without ever being there, at least not openly. As Marisa stepped outside to load the girls into her car, she felt it again, that prickle of unease at the back of her neck. Her eyes scanned the quiet street, catching sight of a black sedan parked just far enough to avoid suspicion. The driver's face was obscured, but the car had been there yesterday, and the day before that. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Sophie asked, clutching her favorite pink backpack. Marisa forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Let's get going." The drive to Sophie's school was uneventful, but Marisa couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the black sedan trailing her. Nothing. Just her own tired reflection and Emily's tiny, curious face in the car seat. At work, Marisa immersed herself in her students, finding solace in their laughter and progress. But during lunch, a text from her lawyer jolted her back to reality. Custody hearing moved to next week. Be ready. Her heart sank. She had hoped for more time to prepare. The hearing would be another battlefield with Kathleen leading the charge. Kathleen's accusations of neglect were baseless, but her icy demeanor and knack for manipulation gave her an edge Marisa couldn't underestimate. After work, as Marisa approached her car in the school parking lot, a folded note tucked under her windshield wiper stopped her in her tracks. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded it, her hands trembling. Scrawled in sharp, uneven letters were the words, "You don't deserve her." Marisa's breath hitched. She scanned the parking lot, her eyes darting to every corner. Empty. Just the hum of distant traffic and the rustle of leaves. Her fingers fumbled for her phone as she called Vanessa, her closest friend and confidant at work. "Vanessa," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone left a note on my car." "What kind of note?" Vanessa's tone sharpened. Marisa read the words aloud, barely suppressing the crack in her voice. "Call the police," Vanessa urged immediately. "This isn't just someone being petty. It sounds like a threat." Marisa hesitated. Calling the police would mean documenting the incident, potentially adding fuel to Kathleen's claims of instability. "I can't," she whispered. "Not now." That night, after putting the girls to bed, Marisa sat by the window, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Outside, the streetlights bathed the pavement in an eerie glow. She thought about the black sedan, the note, and the faint scrape of shoes she'd heard earlier when locking the door. She told herself it was her imagination. It had to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voicemail notification. Her lawyer's number flashed on the screen, but as she played the message, her blood ran cold. The voice wasn't his. A distorted, almost mechanical tone crackled through. "You think you can win this? Think again." Marisa's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. The phone slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The room suddenly felt too quiet, too still, as though the shadows themselves were listening. The courtroom was colder than Marisa had anticipated, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The air buzzed with quiet tension, a stark contrast to the murmured conversations in the hallways just outside. Every click of a pen, every shuffle of papers seemed amplified. Marisa adjusted her seat, her pulse quickening as she glanced toward the defendant's table. Kathleen Lee sat there, her posture impossibly straight, her expression carved from stone. Beside her, Zachariah slouched slightly, avoiding eye contact. Marisa tightened her grip on her pen, a silent act of defiance. She wouldn't let them see her falter. Not now. "All rise," the bailiff called, and the room stood as Judge Rosen entered. He was a man of few words, known for his sharp wit and sharper decisions. As he settled into his seat, the courtroom hushed. The hearing began with Kathleen's attorney, a man who carried himself with an air of practiced arrogance. He wasted no time in painting Marisa as an unfit mother. "Your Honor, my client's concerns are not born from malice, but from genuine fear for the child's well-being," he said, his voice smooth and calculated. Marisa Galloway has demonstrated a pattern of neglect, as evidenced by reports of tardiness at daycare and the testimony of concerned neighbors. Marisa's jaw tightened. Reports? Testimony? She darted a glance at her lawyer, Adam Carlson, who gave her a subtle nod of reassurance. His confidence in the face of such blatant lies steadied her nerves, if only slightly. Adam rose to respond, his tone measured but firm. "Your Honor, these so-called reports are nothing more than hearsay, conjured to cast my client in a negative light. The truth is, Marisa Galloway is a devoted mother and a respected educator in her community. She has faced unwarranted scrutiny at the hands of Kathleen Lee, who, as we will demonstrate, has a long history of overreach and control." The judge's gaze shifted to Kathleen. "Mrs. Lee, do you have evidence to substantiate your claims?" he asked, his tone direct. Kathleen didn't flinch. "I have the child's safety in mind, Your Honor. That is all the evidence I need," she replied, her voice calm but laced with venom. Marisa felt the weight of Kathleen's words like a cold hand gripping her throat. As the arguments continued, the tension in the room grew palpable. Marisa's heart pounded as Adam presented a series of character testimonials from her colleagues and friends. Each one painted a picture of a dedicated mother and teacher, a stark contrast to the image Kathleen was trying to project. Vanessa's testimony was particularly moving. "Marisa is the kind of person who puts everyone else first," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen her work late into the night for her students and still make time to be there for her daughters. To suggest otherwise is not just unfair, it's untrue." For a moment, Marisa allowed herself to breathe, but the reprieve was short-lived. Kathleen's attorney called Zachariah to the stand. Marisa's stomach twisted as he took his place, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor. His testimony was hesitant yet damaging. I think my mother only wants what's best for Sophie," he said. The words were carefully chosen, but the implication was clear. He wasn't standing with Marisa. The final blow came when Kathleen's attorney produced a letter, allegedly written by a concerned neighbor, claiming to have seen Marisa leave Sophie alone in the front yard on multiple occasions. The letter was vague and unsigned, but its timing was calculated. The judge, though visibly skeptical, allowed it to be entered as evidence. Marisa's hands clenched into fists under the table. She wanted to scream, to refute every word, but Adam placed a calming hand on her arm. "We'll handle this," he whispered. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Marisa lingered in her seat, staring blankly at the table. Kathleen walked past, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She paused just long enough to lean in and whisper, "You're losing, dear." Marisa's breath caught in her throat, but she refused to react. Instead, she stood, her back straight, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Outside, Vanessa was waiting for her, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "We'll fight this," Vanessa said firmly. "They don't get to win." Marisa nodded, her resolve hardening. The battle was far from over. The days after the hearing felt heavy for Marisa. Though Adam reassured her their case remained strong, Kathleen's whisper lingered in her mind. "You're losing, dear." Those words, delivered with chilling precision, felt like a prophecy. On a brisk Thursday morning, Marisa woke before dawn. Emily had been restless, her cries breaking the stillness of the night. After soothing her back to sleep, Marisa sat by the window, nursing a mug of coffee. The quiet street seemed unnaturally still, as though it was holding its breath. Her gaze wandered, and there it was again, the black sedan. Parked at the edge of the block, its windows tinted dark. Her heart thudded. She told herself it could be anyone, a neighbor's guest or a delivery driver, but the timing was too perfect. The car always seemed to appear when she felt most vulnerable. She made a mental note to mention it to Vanessa later, though she doubted there was anything they could do. Later that morning, as Marisa dropped Sophie off at school, her unease grew. Sophie, ever perceptive, noticed. "Mommy, why do you keep looking behind us?" she asked, her small hand clutching Marisa's tightly. Marisa forced a smile. "Just being careful, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about." But there was something to worry about. As Marisa turned back to her car, she caught the faintest movement in the distance, a shadow slipping behind a tree. Her breath quickened. She looked around, scanning for any sign of who it might have been, but the sidewalk was empty. By the time she arrived at work, Marisa felt on edge. The school parking lot, usually a source of comfort, now felt exposed. She parked closer to the building than usual, glancing over her shoulder as she walked in. Inside, Vanessa was waiting for her in the teacher's lounge. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Vanessa said, concern etched on her face. Marisa hesitated, unsure if voicing her fears would make them feel more real. "There's this car. It's been parked near my house, and this morning I thought I saw someone watching me." Vanessa's brow furrowed. "You need to report this, Marisa. This is starting to sound serious." "I can't," Marisa whispered. "Kathleen will use it against me. Make me look paranoid, unstable. I can't give her any ammunition." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself. Instead, she reached for Marissa's hand. "Then let's keep track of it. Write down every time you see the car or notice anything strange. If it escalates, you'll have a record." Marisa nodded, grateful for the support. But as the day wore on, her anxiety only deepened. She found herself glancing out the windows between lessons, her heart racing each time she thought she saw something move. By evening, exhaustion weighed heavily on her. After putting the girls to bed, she checked the locks on every door and window. Her hands shook as she twisted the latch on the back door, double-checking it was secure. She tried to push the fear aside, telling herself it was all in her head, but the nagging doubt refused to fade. Around midnight, Marissa's phone buzzed. She grabbed it quickly, fearing it might wake Emily. The message was from an unknown number. "You should pay more attention." Her blood ran cold. The words were vague, yet menacing. Her hands trembled as she reread the message, the air around her seeming to grow heavier with each passing second. She wanted to call Vanessa or Adam, anyone who might have answers. But the thought of Kathleen's reaction kept her paralyzed. The next day, Marisa decided to take action. After dropping Sophie off at school, she drove straight to a local auto shop, asking them to check her car for any issues. The mechanic, a man named Roy, greeted her with a friendly smile, but as he inspected her vehicle, that smile faded. "Did you know there's a tracker under here?" he asked, holding up a small device no larger than a matchbox. Marissa's world tilted. A tracker? Who could have? Her mind immediately went to Kathleen, the black sedan, the shadow in the distance. It all clicked into place, each piece fitting together with horrifying clarity. She thanked Roy, her voice barely steady, and took the tracker with her. She sat in her car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel tightly, her breath shallow and uneven. Marisa knew she had to tell someone, but who? Vanessa would insist she go to the police. Adam might see it as an opportunity to strengthen their case, but Marisa wasn't ready for the confrontation she knew would follow. As she drove home, her paranoia reached a fever pitch. Every car behind her felt like a threat, every pedestrian a potential enemy. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she was emotionally drained. But one thing was certain, she wasn't safe, not anymore. Kathleen Lee sat in her modest living room, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Papers were strewn across the coffee table, court documents, printed emails, photographs of Sophie, and one lone image of Marisa smiling brightly with her daughters. Kathleen's hands trembled as she stared at it, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Her mind buzzed, a chaotic tangle of resentment, fear, and resolve. She couldn't let Sophie grow up in Marissa's care. Marisa, with her polished exterior and unwavering confidence, had taken everything Kathleen cherished. Her son, Zachariah, was weak, too passive to protect his own child. And Kathleen knew deep down that the court would side with Marisa. They always sided with the mother. The thought made her stomach twist. Kathleen reached for the glass of water beside her, knocking over a stack of papers in the process. Among them was a diagnosis form from her oncologist, the bold words staring back at her. Stage 4 metastatic cancer. Time was slipping away, each second a taunt she could no longer ignore. Kathleen had tried to play by the rules. She had gathered evidence, filed complaints, and appeared calm in court. But the judge's skeptical gaze and Marissa's polished rebuttals made it clear. This battle wasn't hers to win. Not through legal channels anyway. Her phone buzzed, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Zachariah. "Mom, let it go. This isn't helping." "Let it go?" Kathleen's grip tightened on the phone. Zachariah didn't understand. He couldn't. He had spent his entire life under her protection, oblivious to the sacrifices she had made to ensure his future. And now, when his own daughter was at risk, he wanted to let it go? "No," she muttered aloud, her voice echoing in the empty room. "I won't let it go." The decision crystallized in her mind like ice forming on a window pane. Kathleen reached for her laptop, opening the file she had been compiling for weeks. It contained every perceived flaw of Marissa's, every late daycare drop-off, every moment of perceived neglect. It wasn't much, but it was enough to convince herself that she was right. But Kathleen knew that evidence alone wouldn't secure Sophie's future, not in time. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the room where a locked drawer sat. Inside was a handgun, purchased legally years ago, now loaded and waiting. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, the confrontation, the resolution. The thought both terrified and steadied her. She would do what needed to be done, for Sophie, for Zachariah, for the legacy she refused to let slip away. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from her private investigator. He had flagged several inconsistencies in Marissa's life, minor infractions, but ones Kathleen could use to build her narrative. A small smile tugged at her lips. Every detail, no matter how insignificant, was another weapon in her arsenal. But when the investigator mentioned stepping away from the case, citing concerns over her growing obsession, Kathleen's smile vanished. "Coward," she hissed, deleting the email without replying. She didn't need him. She didn't need anyone. That night, Kathleen sat at her dining table, pen in hand, and began to write. Each word was a declaration, a justification for the plan forming in her mind. "To the court, to my family, to Sophie, this is for you." The letter stretched for pages, her handwriting growing more erratic as she poured out her fears, her anger, her unwavering belief that this was the only way. Her pen stopped abruptly. A thought crept into her mind, one that sent a shiver down her spine. What if she failed? What if Marissa somehow twisted this against her, turning the act into another reason to strip Kathleen of her dignity? The idea burned like acid, but Kathleen forced it away. She couldn't afford doubts now. The wheels were already in motion. As the clock struck midnight, Kathleen stood and walked to the locked drawer. Her fingers trembled as she turned the key, her heartbeat a deafening roar in her ears. The cold weight of the gun in her hand felt both foreign and familiar. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath shallow. This wasn't a decision, it was a necessity. In the darkness of her home, Kathleen whispered to herself, her voice barely audible but resolute. "They'll understand someday." Marissa sat on the edge of her bed, the pale light of early morning filtering through the curtains. The tracker, now in a plastic evidence bag on her dresser, seemed to glow under the muted light. Its presence was suffocating, a silent reminder that someone, somewhere was watching her every move. She hadn't slept. Every noise in the night had her bolting upright, clutching her phone in trembling hands. Emily stirred in her crib, her tiny fingers curling into a fist as she sighed in her sleep. Marissa's chest tightened. She had to protect her daughters, no matter what it took. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp buzz of her phone. A text appeared from an unknown number. "You can't hide forever." Marissa's breath hitched. The words were brief, but the menace was palpable. Her mind immediately raced to Kathleen. Was this another step in her psychological warfare? At breakfast, Marissa shared the message with Vanessa. They sat in the teacher's lounge, the hum of coffee machines filling the silence as Vanessa read the text, her face darkening with concern. "You can't ignore this anymore," Vanessa said firmly, sliding the phone back to Marissa. "This is escalating. You have to call the police." "I can't," Marissa whispered, her voice shaky. "If Kathleen finds out, she'll twist it. She'll say I'm unstable, paranoid. You saw how easily she manipulates people." Vanessa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You're not unstable, Marissa. You're in danger. There's a difference." Marissa nodded slowly but said nothing. Her heart was pounding too loudly to focus on anything else. Later that day, as Marissa walked to her car in the school parking lot, she froze. Her tires had been slashed, all 4 of them. She glanced around the lot, her eyes darting to every car, every shadow. Whoever did this had taken their time, ensuring the damage wasn't rushed. The message was clear: "I can get to you." Marissa's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She called Adam, her lawyer, and struggled to keep her voice steady as she explained what had happened. "Marissa," Adam said, his tone a mix of calm and urgency, "you can't keep this to yourself. This isn't just about the custody case anymore. This is harassment. You need to file a report." "I know," she replied, barely above a whisper, "but I can't. Kathleen will—" "She's already doing it," Adam interrupted. "She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants. You have to push back." Marissa clenched her jaw, anger bubbling beneath her fear. "I'll think about it." By the time she returned home, Marisa was emotionally spent. She tucked the girls into bed early, their sweet innocence a temporary balm to her frayed nerves. But as the house settled into silence, the weight of everything crashed down on her. She sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands, when a knock at the door shattered the stillness. Marissa's stomach dropped. It was nearly midnight. Who would come at this hour? Slowly, she approached the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Her fingers hovered over the lock. Every instinct screamed at her not to open the door, but she couldn't let her fear control her. She opened the door a crack, just enough to peek outside. No one was there. But on the doorstep lay a single envelope. She snatched it up and quickly closed the door, locking it behind her. The envelope was plain, unmarked. Inside was a single piece of paper, the words scrawled in a familiar, jagged handwriting. "Time is running out." Marissa's legs buckled, and she sank into a chair, clutching the note. Her chest heaved as panic set in, the walls of the room seeming to close in around her. Kathleen was unrelenting. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was a declaration of intent. Marisa called Vanessa, her voice barely coherent, as she recounted what had just happened. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed. "She's everywhere." "Listen to me," Vanessa said, her voice steady but urgent. "You're not alone, Marisa. You have people who care about you. Let us help you." Marisa wiped her tears, nodding even though Vanessa couldn't see her. "Okay," she whispered, though the fear in her heart remained. "Okay." As she hung up, Marisa resolved to fight back. But deep down she knew Kathleen wasn't playing by any rules, and the next move could be the one that broke everything. The morning air was crisp, the kind of chill that hinted at the changing seasons. Marisa bundled Emily in her coat, zipping it up tightly as the toddler giggled, her cheeks flushed pink.
Sophie
stood nearby, clutching her backpack, her small hand wrapped around Marissa's. It was an ordinary morning, or so it seemed.
All right,
girls, Marisa said with a forced brightness.
Time to get going.
She didn't feel calm, but for her daughters, she had to pretend. The note from the night before was still on her mind, its ominous words echoing like a warning she couldn't ignore. Time is running out. She had resolved to speak with Adam after dropping off the girls. Enough was enough. Kathleen's escalation was too dangerous to dismiss anymore. The drive to Sophie's school was uneventful, but Marissa's eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror. Every car behind her felt like a threat. Every slow-moving vehicle like a trap waiting to spring. She pulled into the drop-off lane, kissing Sophie on the forehead before helping her out of the car. "Bye, Mommy," Sophie chirped, running toward the school doors. Marisa waved, her smile faltering as the black sedan appeared down the street. It parked a block away, far enough to seem coincidental, but close enough to feel deliberate. Her stomach clenched. She turned away, guiding Emily back into the car. The drive to daycare felt interminable, the shadows of her own fears growing longer with each passing moment. When she arrived at the daycare, she pulled into her usual spot, glancing around before unbuckling Emily. The black sedan was nowhere in sight. Relief washed over her, though it felt premature. She reached into the back seat, her hand steadying Emily as she lifted her into her arms. The sound of tires screeching broke the quiet. Marisa froze, spinning toward the noise. A car had pulled into the lot fast, too fast. The black sedan. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The door of the sedan opened and Kathleen stepped out. Her expression was calm, almost serene, but her eyes burned with a terrifying intensity. She held a tote bag at her side, the weight of it making the fabric sag unnaturally. "Kathleen?" Marissa's voice trembled. She shifted Emily protectively against her chest. "What are you doing here?" Kathleen took a step closer, her movements deliberate. "I just wanted to talk," she said, her voice smooth. Too smooth. "This isn't the place," Marisa said, her pulse quickening. "You need to leave."
"I just wanted to talk."
But Kathleen didn't leave. Instead, she reached into the tote bag, her hand emerging with a gun. The world seemed to stop. The morning's serene normalcy shattered in an instant. "Please," Marisa whispered, her voice barely audible.
"Please,
Kathleen, don't do this. You've taken everything from us," Kathleen said, her tone cold, detached. "From Sophie, from Zachariah. I won't let you ruin her life." Marissa's mind raced, her grip on Emily tightened. She glanced toward the daycare entrance, hoping for anyone to intervene. But the lot was eerily empty. "You don't have to do this," Marisa pleaded. "We can work this out. Sophie needs both of us in her life." "No," Kathleen said simply, raising the gun. "She needs saving." The first shot rang out, echoing like a thunderclap in the quiet lot. Marisa staggered, the impact forcing her to the ground as she clung to Emily. The second shot followed, sharp and final. Marissa's body crumpled, her arms instinctively shielding Emily as blood pooled beneath her. Kathleen stood over her, the gun trembling in her hand. Emily's cries pierced the air, a heartbreaking wail that broke through Kathleen's calm facade. For a moment, her resolve wavered. But then, as if steeling herself, she raised the gun one last time. This time, toward herself. "I'm sorry," Kathleen murmured, her voice barely audible before she pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was deafening. The scene lay frozen in time, Marisa lifeless on the ground, Emily sobbing beside her, and Kathleen's body slumped nearby. A daycare worker, drawn by the commotion, appeared at the door, her scream splitting the air as she took in the horror before her. Within minutes, the lot was swarmed by police and paramedics, their flashing lights painting the scene in harsh reds and blues. Emily was carried away, her cries echoing long after the ambulance doors closed. And just like that, the fragile normalcy Marisa had fought so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by the cold finality of tragedy. The daycare parking lot was eerily quiet, except for the muffled cries of Emily from the back of an ambulance. Paramedics worked swiftly, their voices clipped and professional, but the air was thick with the weight of what had just occurred. Police officers cordoned off the area, their radios crackling with updates. The scene was a stark contrast to the usual laughter and chatter of children in the nearby playground. Detective Amanda Cruz stood at the edge of the chaos, her arms crossed tightly as she surveyed the scene. She had seen her share of tragedies, but the sight of Marissa's lifeless body, slumped protectively over her daughter, struck a chord she couldn't shake. Beside her, Officer Reynolds finished taking statements from the daycare staff, who were still trembling and pale from the shock. "She came out to check what the noise was," Reynolds said, nodding toward the head teacher, Mrs. Dunlap. "Saw everything from the doorway." Detective Cruz approached the teacher gently. "Mrs. Dunlap," she began, her voice soft. "Can you walk me through what you saw?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I heard shouting," she whispered. "And then, 2 gunshots. When I looked outside, I saw her, Marisa, on the ground, holding the baby. And then the other woman, she shot herself." Cruz took a deep breath, jotting down every detail. "Did you recognize the other woman?" she asked. "I think it was her mother-in-law," Mrs. Dunlap replied shakily. "I've seen her here before, watching from the parking lot." Cruz exchanged a glance with Reynolds. "Let's confirm her identity and get a full timeline," she said, her voice firm now. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. The confirmation came quickly. Kathleen Lee's wallet, recovered from her bag, left no doubt. But it wasn't just the IDs that painted the picture. It was the neatly folded letter addressed to the authorities, tucked beside the weapon. Cruz unfolded it carefully, her brows furrowing as she read. "To the court, my family, and Sophie, this was never an easy decision, but it was the only one I could make. I couldn't stand by while Marisa destroyed my granddaughter's future. Everything I've done has been for Sophie's sake. I hope someday you understand." The letter was signed with Kathleen's full name. Cruz passed it to Reynolds with a sigh. "She thought she was saving her," Cruz murmured. "This was calculated." By late afternoon, news of the tragedy had spread across the city. Marissa's friends and colleagues gathered at the school, their shock and grief palpable. Vanessa stood in the middle of the teacher's lounge, tears streaming down her face as she clutched a framed photo of Marisa with her students. "She didn't deserve this," Vanessa said, her voice trembling. "She was just trying to be a good mom. She just wanted to protect her kids." Adam Carlson, Marissa's lawyer, arrived at the scene later that evening, visibly shaken. He spoke briefly to the press, his words somber but pointed. "This isn't just a tragedy, it's a failure of the system," he said. "Marisa fought tirelessly for her children, and she paid the ultimate price. We owe it to her memory to ensure this never happens again." At the hospital, Emily was examined and declared unharmed physically, but her cries had not subsided. Social services arrived, initiating the process to place her with Marissa's parents, who were devastated by the news. Sophie, still at school when it happened, had yet to be told. The weight of that conversation loomed heavily over everyone involved. Meanwhile, Detective Cruz continued piecing together the sequence of events leading up to the shooting. Surveillance footage from the parking lot confirmed Kathleen's movements, arriving minutes before Marisa, parking deliberately in the corner, and waiting until her moment to strike. But it was the footage from previous days that deepened the tragedy. Kathleen had been there multiple times, watching, planning. As the day turned into night, the daycare parking lot remained an active crime scene. Marissa's car was towed for further inspection, and the forensic team combed through every detail. But for Cruz, one question lingered. How far had Kathleen's obsession gone? Were there others who knew? Who could have stopped this? The next morning, as sunlight broke through the city's skyline, the news cycle was relentless. Headlines splashed across every screen. Daycare tragedy, mother of two gunned down by former mother-in-law. For those who knew Marisa, the words were a cruel summary of a life far too rich to be reduced to a headline. But for Sophie and Emily, it was the start of a new reality, one shaped by loss, but also by the love Marisa had poured into every moment of their lives. The auditorium was packed, a sea of somber faces illuminated by the soft glow of candles. The stage, typically reserved for school assemblies and talent shows, now held a portrait of Marisa Galloway, framed by flowers and messages of love from her students and colleagues. A simple sign read, "In loving memory, Marisa Galloway, a teacher, a mother, a friend." Vanessa stood at the podium, gripping its edges tightly to steady herself. She had practiced her speech countless times, but now, under the weight of loss and the gaze of so many grieving faces, the words felt insufficient. Marisa wasn't just a teacher, Vanessa began, her voice trembling but clear. She was the kind of person who made everyone feel seen, valued, and loved. Whether it was her students, her daughters, or even her co-workers, she poured her whole heart into everything she did. The audience listened intently, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Among them sat Adam Carlson, his expression a mixture of grief and determination, and Marissa's parents clutching each other for support. In the back, Sophie sat between her grandparents, holding a small bouquet of daisies. She didn't fully understand the weight of the evening, but her wide, searching eyes betrayed her confusion and sadness. Vanessa continued, her voice breaking as she spoke about Marissa's unwavering dedication to her family. She fought so hard for her daughters. She wanted nothing more than to give them a safe, loving home, and she did. Every moment of her life was a testament to that love. As Vanessa stepped down, the room erupted into applause, a wave of gratitude and sorrow that filled the space. One by one, students and parents approached the microphone, sharing stories of Marissa's kindness, her patience, her humor. A fifth grader recounted how Marisa had stayed late after school every day for a week to help her with a science project. Another parent described how Marisa had supported her child through a difficult transition, treating him not just as a student, but as family. But the vigil wasn't just a tribute, it was a call to action. As Adam Carlson took the stage, his tone shifted the room's energy. Marissa's death was not just a tragedy, it was preventable, he said firmly. We failed her. The system failed her. And it's our responsibility to ensure no one else suffers the way she did. He outlined plans to advocate for stronger protections for victims of harassment, particularly those involved in custody disputes. Marisa fought tirelessly for her daughters. Now it's our turn to fight for her legacy, he concluded. His words met with a standing ovation. Meanwhile, Sophie's grandparents were navigating a different battle. The custody hearing for Sophie and Emily was fast approaching, and tensions were high. Zachariah's silence in the wake of the tragedy had only deepened the divide. He had been absent from the vigil, citing emotional strain, but his absence spoke louder than any words could. At home, Sophie sat on her grandmother's lap, her small voice breaking the heavy silence. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her eyes wide and hopeful. Her grandmother's heart broke as she searched for the right words. "Mommy's watching over you, sweetheart," she said softly. "She loves you very much." "Will she come back when I'm good?" Sophie asked, her innocence piercing through the room like a blade. Her grandmother pulled her close, tears streaming silently down her face. As the days turned into weeks, Marissa's impact continued to ripple through her community. The school renamed its library in her honor, dedicating a plaque to her memory. A scholarship fund was established in her name, ensuring that her passion for education would live on. But for those closest to her, the loss was a wound that time could not easily heal. Emily, too young to comprehend the full weight of the tragedy, clung tightly to her grandparents. Sophie, old enough to feel the absence but too young to process its permanence, often asked about her mother in quiet moments. Despite the heartbreak, Marissa's legacy endured, not just in the tangible memorials, but in the countless lives she had touched. Her strength, her love, her resilience were a reminder to all who knew her of what it meant to truly care. And as the community rallied around her family, one thing became clear. Marisa Galloway was gone, but she would never be forgotten. The courthouse buzzed with quiet intensity as the custody hearing for Sophie and Emily began. Marissa's parents sat stiffly in the front row, their grief replaced by a steely determination to protect their granddaughters. On the opposing side, Zachariah sat alone, his gaze fixed on the polished floor, his expression unreadable. The judge, an imposing figure with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, called the proceedings to order. "This court is convened to determine custody of Sophie and Emily Galloway," he said. "All arguments and evidence will be considered before a decision is made in the best interest of the children." Adam Carlson, representing Marissa's parents, began his case with precision. "Your Honor, we contend that the children's father, Zachariah Reed, failed to act in their best interest. His negligence enabled an escalating pattern of harassment by his mother, Kathleen Lee, culminating in Marisa Galloway's tragic death." Adam's words hung heavy in the air. Zachariah shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. Adam continued, his tone resolute. "We have evidence to support that Zachariah was aware of his mother's behavior and chose to ignore it. This negligence puts the children at risk." The judge gestured for Adam to proceed. "Present your evidence." Adam approached the bench, a folder in hand. "Your Honor, these are emails exchanged between Mr. Reed and Kathleen Lee. They outline Kathleen's intentions and Zachariah's passive complicity." He handed the documents to the court clerk, who passed them to the judge. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the emails. His expression darkened. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice low but firm, "would you care to explain these correspondences?" Zachariah stood, his hands trembling. I didn't think she'd actually do it," he stammered. "She talked about protecting Sophie, but I thought it was just venting. I didn't know she'd go this far." Adam seized the moment. "Your Honor, this demonstrates a clear failure to protect not only Sophie but also Marissa. Zachariah had knowledge of Kathleen's escalating behavior and did nothing to intervene." Zachariah's attorney attempted to salvage the situation. "Your Honor, my client is grieving. He never condoned his mother's actions and should not be held responsible for her independent decisions." The judge held up a hand, silencing the defense. "While grief is a consideration, the welfare of the children must come first." The next witness was Detective Amanda Cruz. She recounted the evidence from Kathleen's stalking and the surveillance footage from the daycare. "The footage shows Kathleen watching Marissa's movements for weeks," Cruz explained. "This wasn't impulsive, it was premeditated. And the emails reveal that Zachariah knew about her fixation." Marissa's parents sat stoically, their resolve unwavering. For them, this wasn't just about custody, it was about justice for their daughter. The final blow came when Adam introduced Kathleen's diary. "Your Honor, this journal recovered from Kathleen's home provides a detailed account of her plans. It includes entries about conversations with Zachariah, where he expressed his frustrations about Marissa." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order, his gaze fixed on Zachariah. "Mr. Reed, this court cannot ignore your inaction. While you may not have directly participated, your failure to address your mother's behavior contributed to these tragic events." As the hearing adjourned, the judge announced his ruling. Pending further investigation, custody of Sophie and Emily will be granted temporarily to their maternal grandparents. A wave of relief washed over Marissa's parents. But for Zachariah, the weight of his choices seemed to crush him. He sat motionless, his face pale as the reality of the situation sank in. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for statements. Adam, standing beside Marissa's parents, addressed the crowd. "This is a step toward justice, but it's only the beginning. We will continue to fight for these girls, just as Marissa would have." In the back seat of her grandparents' car, Sophie clutched her daisy bouquet tightly. She turned to her grandmother and asked in a small voice, "Will Mommy be proud of me now?" Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears and she hugged Sophie close. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mommy has always been proud of you." As they drove away, the courthouse faded into the background, but the fight for Marissa's legacy and her daughter's futures was far from over. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the modest suburban house where Marissa's parents now lived with Sophie and Emily. The air was calm, but inside the weight of what had happened still lingered. Each room seemed to echo with the absence of Marissa, a silence filled only by the sounds of her daughters trying to navigate their new reality. Sophie sat on the living room floor, her crayons scattered around her as she worked diligently on a drawing. Emily toddled nearby, occasionally picking up a crayon and offering it to her sister, babbling in her tiny voice. Marissa's mother, Diane, watched them from the kitchen, her hands busy with dinner but her heart heavy. "How are they doing today?" asked Marissa's father, Robert, entering the kitchen. His voice was quiet, laced with exhaustion. "Sophie hasn't said much," Diane replied, glancing toward the living room. "But she's been drawing pictures of Marissa again. Emily seems too young to understand, but I think she feels the change." Robert nodded, his gaze distant. "It's hard to believe we're here, fighting battles she shouldn't have had to fight." The doorbell rang, breaking the quiet moment. Diane wiped her hands on a towel and opened the door to find Adam Carlson standing there, a folder in hand. His face was drawn, his usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the situation. "I wanted to update you on the custody ruling," Adam said as he stepped inside. "The court has finalized temporary custody in your favor, but Zachariah's appeal is moving forward. We need to be ready." Diane's face tightened. How can he even consider fighting this? After everything, after what his mother did? Adam sighed, setting the folder on the counter. He's not contesting what happened, but his argument is that the girls need their father. Legally, he has a case. "Legally," Robert muttered bitterly. "And morally?" Adam hesitated. "Morally, the court may take into account his inaction. The emails, the diary, they all paint a picture of neglect, if not complicity. But we have to tread carefully. Sophie and Emily's future depends on how we handle this." Diane nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll do whatever it takes." That evening, after Sophie and Emily were tucked into bed, Diane sat in the quiet of the living room, sifting through Marissa's belongings. She pulled out a small journal, its cover worn from use. Inside were pages filled with Marissa's neat handwriting, notes about her students, goals for her daughters, and reflections on her struggles. One entry caught Diane's eye. "No matter what happens, I want Sophie and Emily to know they are loved. Every choice I've made has been for them. I just hope they'll understand someday." Tears blurred Diane's vision as she closed the journal, holding it close to her chest. She whispered a silent promise to her daughter. "We'll make sure they know." The following week, the family attended the dedication ceremony at Sophie's school library. The space had been renamed in Marissa's honor, a plaque mounted on the wall bearing her name and a simple inscription, "Inspiring Love and Learning." Sophie clutched Diane's hand tightly as they entered the library, her eyes widening at the sight of her mother's picture on the wall. "Mommy's really here," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of wonder and sadness. "She is," Diane replied, kneeling beside her, "and she always will be." The days stretched into weeks, and while the grief remained, life began to take on a new rhythm. Sophie started drawing happier pictures, sunrises, flowers, and occasionally a smiling woman who looked a lot like Marissa. Emily grew more curious, her laughter filling the house in moments that reminded Diane and Robert of why they fought so hard. One evening, as Diane tucked Sophie into bed, the little girl reached out and touched her grandmother's face. "Do you think Mommy can see us?" she asked. Diane smiled through her tears. "I do, and I think she's so proud of you." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "Then I'll draw her another picture tomorrow." As Diane kissed Sophie's forehead and turned off the light, she felt a small but undeniable sense of peace. It was fragile, delicate as glass, but it was there, a testament to Marissa's strength and the love she had poured into her family. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Marissa's legacy would endure in every smile, every memory, and every step her daughters took toward a brighter future. What do you think of Marisa Galloway and her tragic story? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this one.